In Shanghai, Zhao Long, professor, Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies for Shanghai Institute for International Studies. In Moscow, Anton Fedashian, professor of history at American University. He's originally coming from Russia. Last but not least in D.C., Ambassador William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, former special assistant to U.S. President for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see you. China and the Russian presidents meet once again, virtually, of course. But Mr. Zhao, to China, what is the latest significance of this relationship?
Well, in my opinion, the modern framework of China-Russian strategic partnership started in the 90s. So we have witnessed profound changes in the world situation. So that's why I think the regular meetings, including the video meetings itself, is important signal indicating that our leaders will setting the tone for the mid and long-term development roadmap of our relations. And before renewing as we know, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. So I think then in the general context of the changing international situation, we could expect the further support from each other to jointly safeguard the sovereignty and political institutional security, while adhering and developing the principles that we set up 20 years ago. It's non-alignment, non-confrontation, and non-targeting against third parties. So that's why I think that the voices and positions of two countries on major international and regional issues may be more consistent, and actions will be more coordinated.
Interesting. Professor Fedashian, from Russia's perspective, are the West pushing China and Russia closer, ever closer, or probably the closest in recent decades?
Certainly the closest in many decades that they've been. But remember that the Russians have been trying to do their own pivot to Asia for 25 years now. The original architect of this was Yevgeny Primakov, the late Primakov, who was one of the distinguished diplomats of the Soviet and then post-Soviet era, and nothing was happening in the late 90s and very early 2000s. But then once the Ukraine crisis started happening and the sanctions started being piled on to Russia, it really actually facilitated the rapprochement between Russia and Asia. So yes, from the Russian perspective, all of this was a long time in coming. And the crisis in the relationship with the West has actually stimulated, catalyzed the relationship, the growing relationship and deepening relationship with China. But again, politically, this makes perfect sense. Russia and China are neighbors. China is an enormous market from which to import for the Russians and into which to sell. The relationship, I mean, has been very top-heavy in the sense that Putin and Xi have a very good relationship. Now, whether this can be institutionalized and whether it can outlive the two leaders, one certainly hopes, but that will have to wait and see.
We were going to discuss that question a bit later. Let me go to Ambassador Courtney. You've been working on the issue related to Russia for the U.S. president as a special advisor for years. Tell me more about what do you make of the current position of the U.S.?
Well, the United States has multiple interests. And one of those, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, both the United States and Europe together imposed sanctions on Russia because they saw this as a serious breach of the international security environment in Europe. As a result, the Russian-Chinese rapprochement is something that was unavoidable, but the West is not too concerned about it for the long run.
Very interesting. Meanwhile, Ambassador Courtney, there has been some latest survey conducted in the United States suggesting that the approval rating of President Biden 5 months into the office have been actually pretty good compared to his predecessor. However, when it comes to the administration's way of dealing with China and Russia, the approval rating had been lower than the general numbers. What do you make of that?
President Biden's big success has been mostly on the domestic side. For example, just recently achieving bipartisan consensus on an infrastructure spending package. But overall, President Biden has built a lot of confidence that the way that President Trump dealt with domestic problems was wrong, and that President Biden will be more fair-minded. The approval rating for President Biden in dealing with Russia and China will have very little impact on his overall approval rating. In general, I think there was an more approval than disapproval of Biden's meeting with Putin. President Biden went the extra mile to show that he wanted to have dialogue with President Putin. A lot of people in America thought that was helpful. At the same time, there's a strong bipartisan consensus in the United States to impose costs on Russia if it misbehaves.
I see. Of course, we have noticed, Professor Fidashian, at this point, when a lot of changes are happening, all sides want to appear strong, at least verbally. Tell me more about what do you make of the U.S. Status in terms of its capabilities of dealing with Russia and China on two different fronts, and probably in the future when the two countries getting ever closer, the U.S. capabilities of dealing with that?
Well, look, Tian, that's a great question. First of all, the United States is clearly the dominant economic and geopolitical power. Systemically, it's unchallenged so far. However, one of the things that the U.S. Has always gone out of its way to avoid is to make enemies of both Russia and China at the same time, because that makes so very little sense. There's a reason why one of the most vocal and persistent critics of American policy towards Russia over the past 10 years, roughly, a little bit less, I guess, since the Ukraine crisis, has been Henry Kissinger, because he and Nixon left the U.S. a very powerful legacy in the great geopolitical coup that they brought off in the early 1970s when Nixon went to China, Kissinger, of course, having prepared the way for that. And Washington essentially became closer to Beijing and Moscow than they were to each other. And ever since late 2013, 2014, roughly, what we've seen is a complete realignment of that strategic triangle, with Moscow and Beijing becoming a lot closer to each other than Washington is to either. So the United States is in a powerful position economically, and its ties with China economically, by the way, are a lot stronger and a lot deeper than they are with Russia. But that is slowly changing, and it's in the U.S.'s interests to mend its relationship with Russia and with China in order to realign that triangle and bring it back to the 1970s. But so far, no administration has really succeeded in moving in that direction. Let's see what Biden does. The Geneva summit seems to have been the first step, but a lot will come out in the details. And if the U.S. continues to sort of speak down to Russia and sort of attempt to order it around, that's the feeling in Moscow, then this realignment will not work out in the U.S.'s favor.
I see. We noticed that not long after that meeting in Geneva, the U.S. Once again reimposed the sanctions on Russia. However, all of these could be superficial phenomena, only in the media. What is behind the scenes is still hard to tell. That's why also I want to go to you, Professor Zhao. How do you see China looking at this, what some call the triangle?
Well, in my opinion, constructing such a strategic triangle framework between China, Russia, and the United States it's quite belong to the Cold War paradigm, which is incompatible with reality, today's reality, in such an interdependent world. I think it's almost impossible for three of us alone to dominate the entire world order through the trilateral interactions. And also, I think, difficult to succeed to drive a wedge in the China-Russian relationship because, as mentioned by our leaders, the current strategic mutual trust between two countries is comprehensive and unprecedented. So the strategic cooperation between us is more based on internal driving forces rather than external factors. That's why I think the Chinese policymakers are more focused on the complementary cooperation between China and Russia rather than the influence or the impact of the U.S. policy towards us.
So now let's focus, Professor Zhao Long and Professor Anton Fedosian, on the bilateral relations between China and Russia. Earlier, Professor Zhao argued with Professor Fedosian that China's logic when dealing with Russia is not necessarily has to do with its reference with the United States, but rather the other way around, mainly focusing on bilateral. Professor Fedosian, how much do you see that is also the logic from the Russian side? How sustainable will that be?
It'll have to be sustainable for Russia because Russia has a problem with its population and its economy in the Far East. The demographic weight of Russia is in its European part, where the Russians have been trying to develop their Far Eastern and Siberian economy to a point where it actually attracts people to settle there or to stay there, to move there from the European part and of Russia, I mean. And the best way to do this is to actually develop Russia's relationship with China, to develop the infrastructure in the Far East, to develop trade along the Chinese-Russian border in order to kickstart Russian development over there. Climate change is something that everyone is very well aware of. We're actually in the middle of an unprecedented heat wave here in Moscow, but also in Siberia. And agriculture will be spreading, moving northwards in Russia. And given that this is by far the biggest country in the world, the Russians stand to make an enormous amount of money by opening up new areas to agriculture. But to do this successfully, they need people, they need development, they need roads, they need technology.
The two sides, its trade in 2018 is 100 billion. It's decided that it's going to double that by the year 2024, which is about 3 years from now. Now, besides what Professor Fedosian been talking about rural development, agriculture, and some of the other infrastructures, how is China and Russia likely to achieve this goal? In which regard?
I think we do share the similar vision. It's almost impossible to meet $200 billion trade goal only relying on oil and gas, which is a traditional way that we are conducting our bilateral trade. And also under the background of the advancement of the carbon peak and the carbon neutrality targets for major economies, including China, I think the Sino-Russian energy partnership needs to be upgraded and optimized. And that's why I think the nuclear energy, hydrogen energy, renewable energy cooperation represent the new growth point for our bilateral trade. And we are trying to transform our the energy trade, from energy trade to the energy technology, equipment, and innovation cooperation. That's, I think, the priority in the future for both of us.
Want to follow up about some of the things you just mentioned. First of all, about the Belt and Road Initiative, which China has been doing for years together with other partners. And also Russia has its own strategic approach toward the Central Asia and beyond. Tell me more about how much of a parallel is this, and how much of a cross of interests this has been so far? Professor Zhao, and then Professor Fidashian.
I think starting from 2014, we are trying to find the approach to docking those two initiatives, including Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's Grand Eurasia Partnership. So in Central Asia, we are trying to coordinate in many ways under the current framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which marks also the 20th anniversary this year. So we are trying to establish a brand new non-Western form of cooperation and coordination in Central Asia. So I think there's a lot of common interests and a common agenda for China and Russia in the Central Asian cooperation, including the security cooperation, and also go beyond to the security matter into the economic cooperation and the social cooperation.
I
think we are starting more visible and significant projects, joint projects in Central Asia.
Cooperation, competition? Professor Fidashian.
Well, I think, listen, it's natural that there will be some competition. Great powers always compete with each other. The question, Tian, is always what form will this competition take? Is it going to be civil and mutually beneficial competition, sort of like the space race, by the way, during the Cold War? Or is it going to be destructive to both sides and to the areas over which the competition will take place? Look, so far, the Russians and the Chinese have shown that they can cooperate more often than compete, and that they can do it to their mutual benefit. This is something that, a lesson that has been lost on the West. I agree with what Professor Zhao just said, and let me just emphasize the importance of the security angle. Look, NATO has failed in its 20-year war experiment in Afghanistan. The nation building has failed. By September 11th, if the U.S. sticks to its own target schedule, all U.S., and that means all NATO troops, will be out of Afghanistan, and there will be a vacuum there. This is a very important area for China and Russia, because for the Chinese and the Russians, Eurasia is not a chessboard, it's the home where people live. And things that happen in Central Asia, especially in Afghanistan, will have repercussions both for the Central Asian former republics, now independent states, and for Russia and for China. So I think we'll see deepening Shanghai Cooperation Organization structures that will realize the handling of conflicts, because the U.S. has shown that it can be reckless and irresponsible at some points, unfortunately. But it has a luxury that neither the Chinese nor the Russians have. It can choose which wars to go into, and then it can choose when to leave and essentially withdraw to its own borders across the Atlantic or the Pacific. Neither the Chinese nor the Russians have this luxury, and so they're going to have to cooperate and work out a way to handle security issues, especially in Central Asia.
Central Asia is now such a buzzword now because of the U.S. And the NATO withdrawal. And as you mentioned, Professor Fidashian, in 20 years, there's still a lack of real political infrastructure in that region in order to guarantee the stability, which, of course, make us really wonder about the success or not of the 20 years intervention. Professor Zhao, let me go to you about also Central Asia, particularly Afghanistan. The Chinese embassy in Afghanistan have been calling on the Chinese citizens to leave that country when they can, and in fact, not advising any visitors to that country anymore. So, Professor Zhao, seems to the Chinese, I think, are very complicated there. So, what is going to be China's role, and China-Russia, interestingly?
I think it's not our mission for China to to fill the vacuum of the Afghanistan in security aspect. But we do consider its situation in Afghanistan will bring a significant challenge to the security of Central Asia and in general the Eurasia. So that's why I think we are now focused on the fighting of the three evil forces and not to have the spillover effect from Afghanistan towards to the north, to the Central Asia. Yeah. So that's why I think in terms of that, China and Russia could have more coordinated cooperation and to maintain the peace and stability and to start the negotiations with the Afghan government and the Taliban representative. As far as I know, there will be a meeting held soon in Moscow about the how to maintain the peace and stability in Afghanistan after withdrawal of U.S. troops. And this meeting will hold under the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think it's quite important for us to join this kind of peace process, not by ourselves, but through the institution framework like SCO.
Another thing that we have seen about the issue about China and Russia is the issue of Iran. How will China and Russia, both are JCPOA partners in a way, how is it going to deal with the current situation and the U.S. changes of attitude frequently? Professor Zhao.
For China's perspective, we are more focused on bilateral cooperation with the new government of Iran, and we signed the long-term treaty or agreement on bilateral cooperation with Iran. So we would like to see what kind of new policy orientations or the new actions will take by the new government of Iran towards to our bilateral cooperation. And of course, we are supportive on the multilateral dialogue with the European Union, with Russia and the United States together on the discussion of the non-proliferation issue of Iran. But I think essentially we are more focused on the bilateral issues with the Iran new government.
Professor Fidashian?
The Russian attitude is quite similar. Remember that even the Obama administration gave the Russians credit for facilitating the JCPOA when it was finally installed, agreed to, and installed. So the Russians played a very important role there in working with the Iranians, essentially acting as the Western representatives to this agreement. So the Russians are perfectly happy with JCPOA and the way it had been unfolding, as were the Europeans, by the way. It was the US that, under Trump, that bolted from this and wrecked the whole structure. So the Russians are very supportive of everyone getting back to the table. But let's also not miss a very cynical aspect of Russian policy towards Iran also. And that is that it's in Russia's interest to also keep Iran sort of destabilized and not too powerful, because in places like Syria, for example, the Russians and the Iranians are competing for influence. And so for Russia, it makes sense to keep Iran at peace, to work with the Iranians, certainly not to treat them as, a pariah nation the way that the US does. But it's also in Russia's interest to maintain a certain level of tension in and around Iran. Remember that it was the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 that empowered Iran to a level that Iran hadn't enjoyed in decades. The destruction of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which had been a natural sort of balancer with Iran, is what made Iran a regional power. And now everyone has to live with the consequences of US actions back then.
Even though the diplomats would love to describe the relationship between China and Russia as limitless as the sky, there are certainly, indeed, a lot of ground for cooperation in this time of dramatic change. I want to thank both of you for your expertise and in-depth analysis in this regard. Professor Zhao Long, Professor Anton Fedassian, really appreciate it. Thank you.